Hello and welcome back to Parley, the show where you folks support the other stuff I make by paying me monthly to talk about the topic of your choice. This month, EyePatchNotes has requested some continued discussion on developer intent, dev-intended gameplay loops, specifically the internal logic that exists before applying player input or excess knowledge of the game's systems. It's important to keep in mind that this is intended to be a discussion parlay, not really an answer, although I do have a piece of actionable advice, at least one, that would be targeted more at developers. I do feel like this type of channel, another example of a channel that has had this effect is Game Maker's Toolkit, if you're familiar. This type of YouTube approach where I'm discussing like game design, often to help the player appreciate or understand or benefit from something, is an effective way to maybe change things about games subtly, to give developers ideas of what we, the players, in a group that we wouldn't be able to give you data normally, would find beneficial. So I do think these questions are often quite helpful, maybe to developers. And as I grow in specificity as a creator, hopefully some of these things will be in games more because we have discussed them. So for what it's worth, I feel like this is a pretty actionable parlay, just not for people that are not game developers. So let's begin. EyePatchNotes says, as a follow-up to developer intention and a primer for future topics, EyePatchNotes is defining divination being primarily useful when applied to what is objectively observably true. Games that focus on the interaction and intersections of systems will inevitably have a logical through line when viewed through a certain lens. So we're talking about developer intent using gameplay elements that refer or flow into each other, the presence or absence of keywords to suggest, not enforce, a build direction, and mechanics that cannot be altered by the player. What is the gameplay unshakably communicating? EyePatchNotes uses the phrase developer intent in a pure form. What does the developer do with a blank canvas? To extend a canvas? Regardless of the answer, what gets published is intent. Harrow, for example, evokes strong themes of headshots and resource manipulation. With an increased irremovable overshields cap, a player focused on health and armor would be fighting against Harrow's kit. That's not to say that health and armor are unwelcome after applying systems knowledge, example toxin damage, which goes through your shields and overshields. But the developer intent can be said to be spotlighting Condemn and Covenant instead. To dredge up Warframe's polarities, they have no meaningful bearing on intent. Because they can always be changed, the truest deciding factor is what cannot, trigger type for guns, 3 out of 4 Warframe abilities, etc. If a completed weapon or frame would ask for, say, 4 forma, using the second or third forma to remove an offending D is a non-cost. Just to clarify for people less familiar with Warframe, EyePatchNotes is evoking something that's come up for me before, certainly as someone who's discussed builds in Warframe for a long time. Warframe will often have polarities, which when you match a mod to that polarity, reduces its cost, which lets you fit more mods on your build. And you can add polarities and change them. It is somewhat common for players, in my experience, to interpret a weapon having a polarity as meaning that you are supposed to put a mod of a certain polarity on the weapon, and for a while D-polarities have not actually done much to benefit your weapon. There are a few more D mods that make sense now, but on a lot of straightforward builds, it doesn't particularly either here or there makes sense to use a D polarity mod. But some players misinterpret, I'm quite confident saying, that as meaning that they are supposed to do the thing. Now, EyePatchNotes is taking an interesting route here by arguing that because in practice, when you forma a weapon, you can change a polarity into something else for the same cost as adding a new one. That means that a player formatting a weapon doesn't pay any more to remove a D and make it into a V than they would if they just put a V on the weapon, which means that having a polarity that doesn't aid the build you intend to make doesn't actually cost anything, provided there aren't like a ton of them, which is true. I never thought about that before. So that kind of intuitively maybe makes the player feel like when it gets down to it, see, you can just remove this, like you just change these. I do feel like that's an awkwardness in Warframe's communication, sure, but that's true. That's interesting. And having it be implicit, like the developer indicates that something isn't meant to be the developer's intent by making it so in practice, removing it doesn't really cost anything, is clever. Like, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that before. In Genshin Impact broadly, EyePatchNotes continues, the gaps between an ability's availability and its cooldown can result in a character running out of things to do, which is perfectly fine. Certain buff states persist and others end when characters are swapped out, creating a natural flow where characters are brought in for as long as they're useful. That's a very concise way to describe Genshin Impact's team build craft. Noelle and Sweeping Time are outliers. Sweeping Time is Noelle's burst. Among the player's first healers from the beginner's wish, you basically get Noelle for free as a starting character. A defensive passive during player onboarding, her shield passive that you get when a character's at low health, is logical. So to pause so far, Ace's build, EyePatchNotes, excuse me, confused with your Twitch handle, is building up a discussion of how it makes sense that Noelle has a passive that gives you a defensive shield when you get low in health, because you get her as a tutorial character to some extent. She's not weaker in any meaningful way than other characters, but the developers know you will have her early. And so it makes sense to give you a passive like this. But, however, EyePatchNotes says, there's also an internal push for Noelle to stay on the field, and thus defy that part of her kit. And she's also a healer. Converting all of a healer's damage to Geo unearths a number of conflicts too, that we can focus on 2 of them. Sweeping Time is reliable as a primary source of damage. Even without specialized knowledge, Noelle's powerful state has a duration to match its cooldown. You can keep her burst up all the time, so if you make it consistent, Noelle's party-wide healing would seldom allow an on-field, low-life ally to benefit from her first passive. And Rapid Crystallize competes with True Healing. A nuance shared with other Geo characters is that shield pickups represent some thousands amount of HP healing. Accepting specific enemies, a party without a healer can thrive on shields alone, though you might not prefer to. If you're confused, what EyePatchNotes is evoking here is the idea that Noelle has a passive that protects characters when they get on low health, other party members when they're low on health, but everything else about Noelle makes it as unlikely as possible that that will ever happen. So it feels like, wow, huh? Like, what? That might feel inelegant. It is more than inelegant. It is unelegant. Sweeping Time, her burst, gives her a powerful way to attack that has potentially 100% uptime. You will almost certainly swap off of Noelle, probably to charge her energy so she can keep using Sweeping Time. But she also comes with a powerful shield on an ability, and the ability to heal, and she's a Geo character, so she'll make crystallized shards which give you shields, which is like kind of even more healing. So you are the least likely of all Genshin Impact characters to have a character that is not Noelle at low health while Noelle is being used on your team actively, which makes it feel a little weird that you get a shield at low life from one of her passives. Now, again, obviously, EyePatchNotes and I, we all know why this passive is here. It's meant to be a sort of onboarding thing, or at least that's a clear purpose that surely occurred to the developers. But why? It just feels so awkward afterward. Like, you get to the point where if you're using Noelle this way, and a sidebar, I don't personally think this character is effective when used any different way. You can do a quick charge attack with her shield to heal a bunch, I guess. I feel like that's pretty meh, but it's all right. You're just not very likely to get any benefit out of that effect. So it's a bit awkward. There is a graphic here. Now, some of the text on this graphic, not to single out EyePatchNotes, it may be intentional, is so small as to make me assume that you were not trying to heal it. But yeah, the idea is that because of the things that Noelle can do, be a primary healer, create shields every other swing with Crystallize, and be a powerful damage dealer that has minimal downtime. It doesn't really make sense that I assume this fourth block of text says when a party member is at low health while Noelle is off of the field, she can provide a temporary shield, blah, blah, blah. Like, that one is kind of the ugly duckling of the litter. It just doesn't really make that much sense. Flashback to Ugly Duckling build craft mentioned in the group Parley last month. Anyway, so yes, I agree that this kind of template, seeing Harrow next to Noelle is really weird, is strange for a game design approach because it creates a moment where the player, when fully understanding a character, looks at a part of their kit and says, but why though? Like, And obviously, this isn't necessarily to indicate anything that is a permanent problem, as per se. Like, people who've played Genshin Impact a lot, Noelle is a very powerful character. It isn't really a problem that one of her 2 passive talents that she gets by leveling up happens to basically not do anything when you use her the way she's often most effective on people's accounts. That's not a negative thing. And yeah, it might seem like, oh, she only has 1 passive talent. But of course, they can just make other aspects of her more powerful, which I would argue they did. Like, she is commensurately more powerful to kind of compensate for the fact that she doesn't really have any passive talents. That's obviously fine. Like, numerically, having 1 less passive talent doesn't really matter. It's a very common thing that I hear people mentioning on threads about characters in games, where they say, like, but that means they basically only have 2 skills, or like they only have 1 passive. But obviously that doesn't actually matter. What matters is the total power budget. Is that actually out of whack? No. This doesn't have anything to do with the character's power level. This has to do with reading the character's kit as a sort of cohesive whole. Now, EyePatchNotes has some caveats. A player's willingness to pick up crystallized shards is secondary to the intent, or in this case, what made it into the live game. If the developers were so inclined, Noelle could have been designed as a non-geo character, not a healer, the list goes on, etc. It's worth noting that players may not actually pick up crystallized shards that much when you play. They could have designed Noelle as well to vacuum up crystallized shards, which you would think wouldn't be very valuable because you could just go pick them up. But we later got Goro, who is a geo character that actually automatically draws his crystallized shards in. Perhaps because the developers noticed that a lot of players just ignore them, even though they're pretty powerful, like you get substantial shields. That's an interesting point. This is particularly the case with, the spoiler reveals C4 Goro, who will actively sabotage future low-life characters who are otherwise content with the invisible HP from Crystallize. Goro, with his Constellation 4 effect, will steadily heal your active character and automatically collects Crystallized shields. Keeping health totals high, but if you want a character's health low, he would have been good for that because of shields, but isn't because he heals you. There's lots of characters that benefit from being at low health. Where Noelle is in melee range and can get crystallized with minimal effort, Goro's burst has a vacuum to make crystallize borderline non-optional. You can avoid crystallized fragments on Noelle if you needed to. Goro sucks them in automatically. You could design Noelle that way. Anyway, interesting point. EyePatchNotes continues, not everyone is engaging at the highest levels of play, of investment. Some players may very well take advantage of all of Noelle's defensive layers that others see as redundant. A point I have a lot of respect for. Of course, it's important to remember that we don't all have the same build situation. Noelle could be viewed as a very cohesive character in that she has this 4th effect, that big text box, which is her shield when a party member is at low life. And here's what it's for. Well, Noelle's very tanky, but when you occasionally swap in another party member, Noelle could be viewed as still protecting them, making it so even in that moment of vulnerability, she has some line of defense to keep that character from dying. Now, on a lot of people's teams, or a lot of the way people play, the character is going to be on the field for such a short amount of time that it'd be pretty baffling if they just got completely one-shotted and died. They will be at low full health after all, because Noelle will have been healing them by attacking with her skill and burst. So yeah, I mean, do you likely need that? No, but there would be a level of player that could conceivably use it, and it's not counter to her goals conceptually necessarily. She's very, very, very good at keeping your entire team alive. Yeah, probably unnecessarily good at keeping your entire team alive, but viewing it that way, the shield seems thematic. So it is a matter of perspective. That was actually the biggest point I was going to make in this parlay, so fine, we'll move on. EyePatchNotes concludes by saying that the parlay author will not deny a sense of perfectionism. However, one player's misplaced constellation can be another player's hook. Within a set of tolerances, unrelated mechanical text can breed creativity rather than contempt. I think that it's that set of tolerances that I'd like to focus on. This was a lot of parlay to build up to an understanding of this whole problem with developer intent. Because, as we demonstrated with Noelle's actually a really good example, It kind of depends how you interpret why Noelle has that passive. A lot of people might, like you and I did, I had this experience too, might really lock on to that shield at low life for a party member being obviously there for new players, right? And then you think about how obsolete it becomes when Noelle is at full power. I think that's broadly true. At the same time, it's hard to argue that it doesn't thematically kind of make sense. It's just sort of unnecessary. Noelle will likely heal more than you need, too. This isn't bad, though. It's just not particularly necessary. So, is there a version of this type of conflict that is kind of inconsistent or dissonant developer intent? Genshin Impact does offer other examples. There are times when, Genshin Impact is a very character-driven game. It's a game that's character is to influence you to be excited about the people in it. It's not just trying to entice you with a character looking cool, compared to a game like Warframe, where a character's abilities, backstory, even we have in Warframe, the quests you go on with them, many things would get you into that particular character. But Genshin Impact features a story in which the character does independent things of their own in the plot that you spend hours experiencing that kind of leads you to have an almost normal human connection with them. That is intended to be one of the ways the game makes money. You come to view them as a person that you want on your team, that you like as an independent entity in some way. That might seem weird. I really don't think it is. In a way that I do not think that other games with still cool character designs, still backstory, still interesting abilities, maybe League of Legends is another example that comes to mind. I do not think those games do the same thing. The character isn't an active agent in the plot of those games, in the same plot that you're taking part in, that does other things alongside you. Not in the same way, in my opinion. And so, in Genshin Impact, the developer has an interesting motivation to make a character somewhat robust if you just insist on using them for something they're not normally meant to be good at. This happens with almost every character. Almost every character in Genshin Impact has some small little detail of their kit that it's maybe not useless normally, but it doesn't really make sense. Like you'd be better off just kind of ignoring that, not building into it. But it's there for people who've decided they are dying on the hill of this character, which the game encourages you to do. So yeah, there's lots of interesting examples. There's some that are just kind of like, okay, this is a utility, but what are you going to do? The one that comes to mind is Diona. She has a constellation effect where her charge shots, which do infinitesimal damage, fire charge up a lot faster when she's in her burst, I believe. Now, Diona scales with HP. Nothing about her kit references her charge shots. You are almost guaranteed to be building Diona in a way, if you're playing to any of her strengths, in a way where she will have meaninglessly weak charge shots. Like, you do not care about her charge attacks. Nothing else about her kit enables that, compared to other options that wouldn't be effective in any particular way. But technically, if you needed to shoot very rapid-fire charge shots, she is really good at that. That's so specific, I doubt it will ever come up as a thing that's valuable about her. But it's not useless, and if you just insist on building damage on that character, like, okay. But the point I'm trying to make is that when you look at it, that definitely is the developer not stating intent. You know, when you look at the character's kit, that directly clashes with their intent. You could almost say that that's kind of a buildcraft red herring, that when you're building Diona, the developers have put something in that we kind of know why they put it in, but in practice, it's often a red herring, a build distraction that you need to figure out you're supposed to avoid to build the character to be as effective as they could. Or think about, who that's for. Now, if you've been on the internet playing video games for longer than a few seconds, you might be thinking, wow, people don't do that at all. Like, that doesn't work. I just said you need to think about how other people play games and the other perspectives that people might have on a character. People do not do that. Like, we can, sure. We do, maybe. But broadly speaking, people don't do that. Like, all the time, hear a basic misunderstanding about buildcraft that is foundational to this channel. You'll hear people say, yeah, it would be bad if you unlocked everything right away, because then, like, the reward for playing through the game would be gone. No, I don't even want to play the game if I have to unlock the buildcraft systems as I go. I want them all unlocked to play the game with, not the other way around. That entire gigantic demographic of people who want that is pretty frequently not even acknowledged as existing by the general public of games journalism. Again, this is fine. They just don't know or whatever. They're not doing it to be rude. I'm just trying to say, like, people don't do this. 9 times out of 10, the player's going to look at Diona's charge attack thing and think, that is literally just pointless. In fact, what people usually say is, see, the developers don't know what's effective in their game. Now, thinking about it from as many perspectives as possible, that is obviously not true. Like, there's a pretty clear motivation for including that just doesn't apply to me, for example. I just don't care. But there's a fairly obvious motivation for doing this thing. Again, I'm quite comfortable claiming it's obviously because, like, that's the way the game makes money, and they want to give you something to play with if you just love that character. There's also, of course, something to be said for remembering my no one knows all builds maxim here. It's possible that there is some surprisingly effective way to use some of these effects. I doubt it for a lot of them. Like, the entire character is built to not even scale with the same stats as would make that do damage. So in that case, I kind of doubt it. But there are other examples. Sinyan comes to mind. Sinyan scales with defense and makes a bunch of shields. She has this thing, though, when you get her last constellation, where she can temporarily get attack for her charge attack or spin from her defense, kind of like what Noelle does. Because this is similar to Noelle, a character that exists from the beginning of the game and which people knew was reasonably effective, and because Sinyan doesn't do a lot of other stuff and has another constellation that kind of encourages her to be an attacker a little bit, it feels believable that there is some way I just haven't tried that is effective. But when you dig into building it, I just personally haven't had success. It's not meaningful to claim one way or another whether there is or isn't any way for that to be an effective way to build, right? It's just worth thinking about, okay, like, that's probably there because it's the carrot thrown to people who just want this character to be their attacker. Clearly, most of her kit supports using her another way. But, like, you could still take it a bit more seriously if you so chose. Rosaria is another character that comes to mind. She just has some bonuses for using her normal attacks, even though they're pretty thoroughly unremarkable. The bonuses are not bad, and so you imagine this is for people who would just like to do that. There's something good about it. That can be fun. Like, it can just make it more enjoyable to use the character if some effect is occurring while you're doing the thing you want to do. So making some aspect of the character have some bone thrown toward it, just in case the player wants to use it, seems reasonable. Again, it's pretty hard to argue that that's not why they're doing that once you take other perspectives, probably other than your own, certainly other than my own, into account. But people don't do that. Like, people usually do not do that. People do not do that well on the internet. And I claim that the indirect effect of this is players nonsensically insisting that the developer doesn't, like, know that that's not effective. It's pretty elementary that those things are not effective. I mean, you need to understand the barest bit about the character to know that that's not effective. It's pretty insulting to suggest that really anyone wouldn't understand that that's not that effective, let alone the people who make the game. Like, they would have to be remarkably stupid for that to be the case. Another thing is, and this is maybe a topic for a separate time, is the idea that developers often wisely hedge their bets and make things a little underpowered to then later buff them up, to avoid making something overpowered that ought to be balanced to be a little weaker to make lots of options viable at the same time. That makes it safer to put things in the game that are weaker at first and that are often buffed up. Warframe does this a lot, although a good amount of the time I'm not sure that they are going to come back to the thing, or they take way too long to come back to the thing, or it's not clear that they don't know that that's really weak. Stuff like that, sure. In Genshin Impact, there's an open question because characters have, for all intents and purposes, not been buffed in Genshin Impact. There isn't really a system by which characters regularly, however seldom, are buffed. It's not never happened before, but there isn't like a feature of the game where characters get a buff quest or whatever, where, you know, after a year or two, the character has an ability brought up in power. That's not a thing we have in the game yet. It almost certainly will be, but currently it isn't, for better or for worse. And so I do feel like that's there's a problem here that should be solved. Developers, we should probably figure out a way for you to provide a little carrot for people that want, you know, that effect on a character. Some little bit of synergy if they just want the character to be an effective attacker. We should probably find a way to help you do that without you making it look like you don't understand your own game. I get that the players saying that are just very stupid. Like, to be very rude for a minute, like that's a pretty absurd thing to claim. But they're going to do it. And so I feel like maybe if there's an easy way to avoid people thinking that, that would be good. And I feel like this way could also be a way to allow players who see an effect on the character that just seems imperfect somehow to maybe switch it out. What comes to mind is basically just talent trees. In Genshin Impact, for example, I think it would be pretty awkward, but it would make constellations maybe a more interesting gameplay element. It would solve this problem, and it would make talents like the one we're talking about on Noelle maybe have a more elegant solution. If you could just pick from 2 or 3 options now and again. It doesn't have to be consistent. It doesn't have to be every time a character has, you know, 6 constellations. All characters in Genshin Impact have that, and 2 passives, they all have that. There doesn't always have to be another option to pick from. It doesn't always have to be the same. I think having a slightly varied amount of those would make it less monotonous to look through a character's abilities and might even help the longevity of the game. I don't know, that's a speculation. That psychology is complicated in my opinion. And a topic for another time, but what I don't think is that complicated is suggesting that giving Diona some weak throwaway passive, not worthless, but just nothing that powerful, you know, that you can then swap out for the quick charge attacks that are basically useless unless you just want to use them, would maybe be better. And I feel like would take very little effort. It would take a little bit of UI design, a little bit of graphic design. But from a development perspective, you don't need to add a new effect here. It can just be like Diona gets 20% shield strength. The whole party gets 20% shield strength when she uses Icy Paws. Or you can pick to get that 40% charge shot time reduction. It might even be more than that. So the player can pick something that is not amazing, but it's some benefit. And the benefit is sufficiently small that the player that wants to use her sort of primary attacker thing can take it without feeling like they're making the character terrible. I mean, they are making the character terrible, but anyway, there is a question about whether or not developers should include these types of things. Should the developer include a tutorial effect with Noelle? Maybe they could use a different design tool to include that effect instead. I do kind of feel like there are clever and unclever ways to do this. You know, in Warframe, we have 50 Warframes, and Excalibur, Mag, and Volt could be read as they just picked among the more elegant and understandable designs of the 50 and made those be the starters, which seems like a good way to do it, right? Like, they're not particularly weaker or stronger. They're not particularly here or there related to the power level of the other stuff in the game. They just chose the ones that are easier to understand first. In Genshin Impact, I feel like that's also mostly true. Noelle is a reasonable character in the game that happens to be a useful new account character. Xiangling is a good example in Genshin Impact. A very simple character to operate that happens to be one of the game's most powerful characters in some contexts. She's very good. It has no bearing on her power level. She just happens to also be a good fit for a newer player, so why not have her be one of the characters you get when you're a new player? It's not the same as some other options. For example, I personally feel like Excalibur being the Umbra Warframe you get in Warframe at that point in the game. Excalibur, for some people's tastes, I'm talking about myself, might be a little bit too simple for me to get too excited about. So I feel like that's a place where like he's the face of the game. Like that's why. But from a build making perspective, it feels like that isn't a perfect compromise. Like getting to maybe pick one of the three starters to be your account's Umbra thing would require a bunch of changes. But my point is that it would avoid the problem of putting something in the game that has a sort of build hook, not really because it should have that build hook as a game piece, but just because something needs to have it, kind of, right? Avoiding having any of these new player things weigh down parts of the game. You could offer another option alongside them. That's not free, but it's not undoable. But you could also structure the game in such a way as to avoid these things. I do feel like developers maybe don't fully understand that this is a negative effect. And that's where I said before that I feel like this is actionable advice. Developers, again, I think it's pretty ridiculous that people think you like don't know that some of these effects are not that effective. They're just useful as a sort of tutorial thing, right? I would hope that the developers of Warframe don't believe that a bunch of abilities do really good damage when they just clearly don't. I mean, all you have to do is build a bunch of strength, go into a Steel Path mission, and hit the button, and you will see that it does not much damage. Like, it'd be pretty unbelievable if they didn't know that. Same thing in Genshin Impact. Like, it's pretty plain to see that some of these effects aren't good as per se. They're just something there for players who want to dig into that character. Perfectly fine. And Genshin Impact's balance is loosey-goosey enough at some points that, like, you can use these things, you know, maybe not at the harder things the game offers. But certainly in the open world, there's not like a problem with spamming Diona's charge attacks. That actually sounds kind of fun. It's not really a big deal. So yeah, like it's a sensible option to offer in that sense. And there's not much you can do because it's financially motivated, right? Like in a lot of cases, Genshin Impact, that's how the game makes money in a major capacity anyway. In Warframe, I think it's important for advertising. Having the quest where you get Excalibur Umbra, having it be Excalibur, the Warframe that people who don't even play the game view as the face of the game. Like, obviously, there's not really a choice to be made there, right? Like, that's why, I guess. But I feel like there could still be more awareness developers. That when you do that, there is actually this negative thing happening. I feel like, I hope this doesn't sound belittling, I feel like a lot of developers don't know that that happens. That a lot of players view them as being maybe not as knowledgeable about the game as they obviously are. Because things like this are in the game, indirectly, players not understanding each other's perspectives, viewing these things as being just completely pointless in every way for all types of people. Obviously, that's just arrogant and stupid of them. But because they think that, you end up with a lot of players who feel like they have evidence that the developer doesn't know what they're talking about, which leads to a player who isn't trying to understand. This kind of couples with a topic I've discussed in previous Parley's streams a lot of times, about how games subtly really need to be careful about their language. Warframe is quite guilty of this. It seems like the exact wording of a mod or something might not matter, and aren't players going to look it up anyway? But statistics show that a lot of the time they don't, and when you make that stuff regular, you really encourage the player to be smart and to think and to engage intellectually with your game. Not to just assume it's confusing, not to go grab a build and just use it because they're confused. It's fine when people just go grab a build because they don't want to make a build. But a lot of people want but can't understand. Want to but can't understand. And those players gain a bad relationship with the game where you could do very little and they wouldn't. There's a trackable moment. I know when they are feeling that way. I feel like from a perspective, not all developers have. So I'm sure no game developers are actually watching this. But certainly something I plan to talk about in the future is this is it from a different direction. This was interesting. I'm into the idea that there's subtle ways to influence it as well, like the developer quietly making the cost of removing something be non-existent, like the polarity thing in Warframe, which does, maybe not even intentionally, but does communicate to the player that you don't really need to care about this thing. That's interesting. I never thought of that before. And again, this idea that in moments where the developer maybe just doesn't worry so much about the wording of that thing, or thinks it's fine, this is just for the people that want this thing, it's no big deal. In those moments, the player disconnects and starts to immaturely, rudely, arrogantly, stupidly, yes, but they do it. They start to act like the developer doesn't know what they're talking about, and they disengage, they kind of check out. I believe in Warframe, this has gotten the game a surprisingly toxic community for a game that started with a very nice one. That's not the only reason. And developers, it's really not your fault, but there is something you can do, in my opinion. I worry that developers are just not aware that this is having that effect to the extent that it is. I'm not sure it is either, but I think it is. So anyway, that's my thing for the end of this one. A really interesting discussion about developer intent. Well, for me, I hope it was for you. I hope this was an interesting direction to take what you wrote. Cool stuff.